I'm here at the Asus booth with JJ at CES 2024, and we're going to have a conversation about motherboard QVL lists and memory stability. Okay, so JJ, why don't you introduce yourself first? Who are you? What do you do?
Yep. So my name's JJ Juan Jose Guerrero. I'm actually the PR Relations Manager for Asus North America. Prior to that, I was actually our Senior Technical Product Marketing Manager for about 6 years. I've been with Asus for about 15 years, so a pretty good chunk of time. I do consider myself an enthusiast. I do actively overclock, and so excited to be able to talk a little bit about how we look at the conversation regarding memory stability, what users have to keep in mind, right, and why it's not necessarily as easy as just what somebody on Reddit says as far as just follow the QVL and it'll all work.
So how does Asus determine what's on the QVL list for whatever motherboard?
Yeah, so I think the QVL is really interesting because technically it's actually two types of QVL that occur. And what I mean by two types is Asus, of course, has its own internal QVL, which goes through our validation team. So we have a designated product manager, which we actually coordinate with memory partners in multiple capacities. Memory partners could actually be directly the IC vendors themselves. So that could actually be like SK Hynix, Micron, right, Samsung, where they're getting maybe developmental sample kits to be able to outline where the performance expectation is. That could come very early in terms of kind of the development of board design. But then you actually then, of course, have later stages where you actually have kits that are being provided directly from, let's say, name brand memory partners. So from, Kingston, Corsair, Patriot, G-Skill, Team Group, Mushkin, whoever it might be as far as you're picking your memory from. In terms of the selection of that validation process, it's always ongoing, it's evergreen. We don't necessarily kind of go like, okay, we're going to lock it and not do anything else. But when I'm talking about also that there can be two types of QVL, we also actively sample our motherboards out during the design and development stage to partners. And so if you take, for instance, look at our QVL, you can also respectively take, for instance, go to G-Skill's website, and they have their own QVL that they've done. And that's actually where they've received boards on their side, and you can actually see two independent forms of validation, but technically using the same motherboard. And so we do consider that part of the totality of our QVL process, because it's not just internally what we're doing, it's also the totality of how we're working with partners. And that actually goes to in a deeper degree, where if you take a look at somebody like Intel has an openly disclosed document called the XMP 3.0 framework. It's actually a database. You can actually look at it yourself, go to Intel's website at XMP, and you can actually download a data sheet. And what you'll actually find is Asus has the largest database of validation for both DDR4 and DDR5 compared to any motherboard manufacturer. So when you ask me like a question like, how do we pursue QVL, who do we do it with, it really can kind of fall into the different buckets, right? Are we talking about local QVL validation? Are we talking about partner validation, right? And to what extent? But the main point is that we don't essentially like limit saying we're going to pick like three partners and like that's it, right? Gotcha. Because also revisions change, different things happen, so it's always kind of ongoing.
So let's say, how do I word this? Let's say then, we can actually segue then. So let's say we're talking about, or let's focus on the QVLs that are kind of on the Asus website then.
Sure.
And like the support page.
Yep,
Right?
Like if you go to the product page, you click the button.
Right, the product page, right. So in order for a memory kit to get onto that product page, how many kind of motherboards and CPUs do you guys kind of test?
Yeah.
Like, does it have to pass 10 different samples? 20, 100, or who knows how many? Or am I on the right track there at all?
No, I understand. So I think to give a little bit of context to this question, the challenge that you have historically with the QVL is that speed actually really matters a lot, right? Because the big thing that doesn't account for is when you talk about what the potential limiting factor is when you talk about DRAM overclocking is that one, you of course have your motherboard topology, and complementary to that you have your firmware, which could be your UEFI, right? The second part is of course the DIMMs itself as far as the resonant ICs and whether they can hit that target. And then the third one, which is actually the big kind of, let's say, third gray area, is actually technically the memory controller, which you never know what the quality of your memory controller is, right? It could be very good, or it could be marginal, or it could maybe be poor, right? And so in that regard, the big challenge that I would say that exists within the QVL is that as you more aggressively go up the QVL, your percentage of success is inherently going to go down because that's in alignment with silicon variance, right? So the QVL, I think, is most beneficial to the consumer or the builder, right, when you're at probably a closer value to the nominal kind of port table. And so if you guys don't know what the port table is, it's just the specifications for the DRAM dividers that are supported by the CPU. So for like 13th gen, right, that's like 5600, right?
Gotcha.
And if you're over 5600, then technically you're at an overclock, right? And so if you buy 6000, that's very marginal, right? We can probably be pretty confident that like 90% of CPUs can all hit 6000. But if you go to like 7600, that's not the case anymore, right? Actually, a much smaller subset of CPUs are going to be able to hit that. Like we can see variants like, we've tested literally like when we do like our Asus AI tuning, you can test like 300 CPU samples, and in that data set we can see, way, you know what, there's actually CPUs that their IMC is as weak as like 6800, right? And then there's the ones that get into that rarefied territory of 78, 8000, 8200, right? And that's where it's really hard, because in the QVL we kind of have to show you almost like of a proof of concept in a way, but has been validated. So the goal there is attempting to try to show you, look, we've tested the topology, we've tested the firmware, we've tested the ICs, and in the, I want to say, the proposed scenario that you have a CPU that can hit that target, which is unknown to you, right? Because you don't know the quality of your memory controller, you may be able to hit that. But there's no way for us to guarantee that. And that's where I think that there's a disconnect in the community, right? Because they'll go, I'm going to go buy 7600, it's on the QVL, I put it in the board and it doesn't post. So therefore, it's our fault, right? Like our BIOS is garbage. You need to fix it, right? And that's not to say that there isn't the opportunity to improve MRC firmware, and you make changes to auto rule voltages or SA voltage, but it can get really, really tricky, because you have to think about it is that, and I'm sure you know from your experience, right? Some CPUs react better to some tuning parameters than others, right? There is no necessarily like perfect scenario. Like sometimes like one CPU might like a little bit more VDDQ and VDDD than another, right? Like you could literally have that be a stable value for this CPU and not have it be stable for another. So we got to test literally hundreds of samples and kind of go for a permutation to go like, what do we generally find is representative of the majority, right? But are there going to be cases where the minority have an issue? Yeah, it's possible, but this is overclocking, right?
So then, okay, that's another perfect segue then. So what would Asus determine as what's RMA-able?
Yeah.
So if let's say,
like where there's an issue, like potentially with like the board, and I think that's actually a really great question, and it gets actually quite tricky, because you could have somebody in theory say, hey, let me buy, I don't know, my Street 690-E board. I bought this 7600 memory, I put it in there, and it doesn't run, right? So I think it's the motherboard. The problem is that most users want to fault the motherboard immediately before they fault the variance of the quality of the CPU. Because in their brain, I think it's just easier to think it's the board's fault, let me just replace the board, right? But if you talk about variance from margin to margin from board, it probably is actually tighter than the IMC variance that exists. If we just talked about like on a 13th or 14th gen platform, and again, this also exists for AMD, this is not independent of, excuse me, this is
Intel?
It's not limited to just an Intel conversation, right?
Gotcha.
The IMC is also equally a factor on AMD as well, right? You have the same kind of constraints in terms of silicon variance, right? But in that kind of situation, it's quite challenging, because the team, when they receive a board back, they're going to run it through. If the board passes full memory stability, which if you load it up and you run it full JDEC, the board passes, it means the board's trace layout is stable, everything's working fine. So what we can't test though is we can't test your CPU, right? You don't RMA your motherboard CPU, and unless you go through a binning routine of like, I'm going to buy 3 CPUs from X e-tailer and try them out, how do you even know the difference? Now, we've tried to maybe give you a little bit of visibility with things like our SP prediction analysis scores, right, for the memory controller. I'd say it's a little bit weaker in terms of its value proposition than like the SP indexing that we do for CPUs. That's just because we can read a little bit more data from like the vid table, which is quite valuable at helping us to kind of get a sense of what the CPU can do in different ways.
The SP on the P course, NE course, is quite accurate.
It's good. It's good. It's good, right?
Yeah.
But sorry, long story short, it's just, how do we handle that in RMA? I think ultimately we go as if the board comes in and the board passes essentially everything at stable operation to a reasonable degree, and I'd say reasonable degree is within the margin of what most CPUs can hit, right? Which for like 13th gen, about probably 75% of CPUs can hit 7000 MT, but where you're going to probably see more variance is once you break that, right? So if the board can do everything there, there's no fault with the board, right? But it becomes that tricky balance of where a user feels like, where's the problem and how much I'm willing to debug to really find out, is it board variance?
Right.
Is it CPU variance, right? Is it a combination of the two? And even the factor of like, is my tuning parameters holding me back? Because you could still fault the board for a certain auto rule set that we have, which is like you set this VDDQ and this VDDD, but if we didn't have any auto rules in place, your overclocking experience would be absolutely abysmal,
So
right?
I actually have another perfect segue then.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it? So I know, but wouldn't it be in Asus's best interest to have a lower QVL though? But then that would actually
Well, we
put
do,
you
right?
behind. I mean, like.
Because the
wouldn't it-
QVL goes all the way down to the port table
Sure,
spec
but when
standard.
somebody sees a higher number, they're going to buy the higher number, kind of thing, right?
Okay.
Let's take the Apex for example. I would say people that buy 7200 kits, it'll work 99.9% of the time on an Apex, right?
I think that's a little
I
bit
know,
high.
in
right?
my experience, right?
But it's high. It's
Yeah,
high,
yeah.
especially on a 2-dim board. You get less signal reflection.
Right.
Yes, better.
Right.
Yeah.
So then wouldn't it be beneficial for Asus to say, okay, 7200 is the guarantee for this board, just theoretical, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then when that reduced support calls and RMA calls and warranty nonsense, but then does that put you behind your competitors in terms of the marketing, right?
It's a tricky
Is that what
balance.
you're right?
There is a tricky balance to this, right? Because you have to find the right line of how do you make sure that you market a message that can be in alignment with competitors on what they're advocating for and saying this is possible, but while also being realistic. Actually, I personally even worked with our CSE team. Take for instance, when DDR5 came about, and tons of users and even most media actually didn't talk about the fact about the port table and that you have a difference when you go with one DPC and one SPC versus two DPC and two SPC, right? And that makes a big difference because you get tons of builders going like, oh, I can run 4 DIMMs, I put it in, XMP broken, again, your BIOS is garbage, right? And I'm like, actually, you didn't maybe understand the port table working correctly because when you're adding in more density, you're actually adding more strain to the memory controller. And if you look the official spec that went from like, let's say, 5600 with 2 DIMMs, it can actually go all the way down to like 3600 officially. So it's actually showing you that that configuration that you think you're overclocking towards is actually much bigger than what you thought. But I think your point is saying, can we try to be more transparent? I think there's always an opportunity, which is why I'm even having this conversation,
I appreciate
right?
It, by the way.
Trying to give that information to the community and say, look, when you get into the land of overclocking, there's a lot of things you got to keep in mind, and can we put more information out there? For sure. But I do think we have even updated our support website to try to give some more detailing there. But yeah, I think we got room to continue to grow.
So, another perfect segue then. So then, as a motherboard reviewer, and I'm sure there's lots of other motherboard reviewers out there, what would Asus, or from your guys' perspective, what would be acceptable in terms of memory validation or like stability testing?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
You know what I'm saying? So
because everybody has their own way that they interpret what is stable and what's not stable, right? You get some people that are like, look, if it passes 1 hour in mem test, you're good. Then there's other people who are like, no, it's got to pass 4 hours, and it's got to pass Kataru, and it's got to pass HCI, and it's got to pass OCCT, right? And different applications have different workloads, and we haven't even got into like thermal aspects.
Right.
If you take a look at original DDR5 memory that launched on the market, and now you've got non-binary memory kits. Non-binary kits actually run significantly hotter. And once you start to get into sometimes like about 55 to 65 degrees, you can actually get to points where you actually get instability in the memory. So a user could go in, put in the kit, enable XMP, run for like an hour, not realize that they're getting heat soak, go from 45 degrees to 60 degrees, and then crash. Right? And if you didn't run a long enough test, right, then you don't do stability. Now, on our side, our team is actually pretty aggressive. We run like an extended routine. It's not like we run for like 15 minutes and we say this passes, right? We have some of the best performance overclockers in the world that are our own performance tuning team. So they really do kind of push the limits to try to get a sense of like, hey, if we feel confident in this, this is confidence to a high degree, right? But again, there's still permutations that we can't ever control, right? We can't, again, control that I've got a really good CPU, maybe it likes a little bit lower VDD and VDDQ, and your CPU, you're gonna have to manually tune that to get a similar level of stability.
Right.
And that's a really hard one because there is almost an expectation the way that memory gets communicated with XMP that it's supposed to be plug and play. And I think to a reasonable degree it is plug and play, but I think that the more that you get to higher and higher values, you have to realize you're consciously have to accept a little bit more culpability to understand more of the conversation, right? It's kind of like saying, look, if you buy a high-speed car, right, if you bought like a car that could go 240 miles an hour, you have to have a little bit of responsibility, understanding that you need to know how to correctly navigate that car. You have to know how to accelerate, take the corners a little bit better, because could you hurt yourself? Yeah, versus if I'm only in a car that can go like 100 miles an hour,
right,
it's inherently a little bit safer, it's a little bit easier, right?
So how would you, okay, so there's two more questions then. What would you recommend in terms of the best, like, so like let's say you're not an overclocker, you're not a tuner, you're just a guy that wants to play games. What would be the best memory kit to get on a Strix level board?
Yeah.
Like,
so
so it just works.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's actually a really great question. I love that you asked that. Thank you. The way I look at it is like if you even go from like our entry Tough Gaming Z790 board, Pro board, which, you know, of course, not always, but generally a good rule of thumb is as you improve in layer count, right, then, you know, if you go from like a mid-loss to like a low-loss PCB, you can improve signal handling, you can get better performance. But even down there, you can do 7,000 MT with no problems. And like I said, with the majority of CPUs able to hit 7,000 MT, that's my recommendation to the community. If you want kind of a sweet spot of going like, I want to be able to overclock, I want to be able to have maybe tighter timings, I want to be able to generally have high confidence of stability, I tell people, look, target either very tight, 6600, or go up to about 7,000 and still keep pretty tight if you want. But that moment that you even break into about 7,200, consider you're going to start to drop off probably below 75% of a likelihood that everything's going to probably just work without you worrying about anything, right? So that's kind of like my cutoff. If 3 out of 4 people could have like a very good experience, I think that's a good target. So I think, and that makes sense if you look at where the most memory kits are being sold in the market. 6600 is right now the kind of like the mass volume of the market, along with 64. 7,000 is definitely come down in price. 7,200 is also pretty inexpensive, so it's a reasonable kind of spec bump to kind of go, if I want to push a little bit more, you know, I bought the 360 hertz monitor, I got 480 hertz, you know, I want to push max FPS, right? I think that's a reasonable target, but after that, I say you got to be prepared. You're going to have to spend some time to get a little bit more in the weeds. It might not necessarily be purely plug and play. You might want to be considering that if it's really important that you increase that likelihood, you might want to consider a 2DIMM board like the Apex, but are you going to pay a lot more? Yeah, you are going to pay a lot more.
So yeah, I'm seeing a trend here from all the people that I've talked to at CES so far. Everyone is really hovering around that 7,000 number.
Well, it's the right number because, again, if you were to take 300 CPU samples, right, you could start to really be able to paint the picture and you could see where the variability is. And this isn't just in DRAM. I know your conversation around DRAM, but a really good example of this is even within CPUs. A lot of people don't realize that the VID, right? So the voltage that you have for your CPU, it's fused at the factory when Intel produces the CPU. And you get sometimes people saying, my motherboard is overvolting my CPU. And I'm like, if you're at F5, we're not doing anything to the board. But some people don't understand that literally one CPU at its base nominal voltage could literally be 1.38 max, and then another CPU could actually be 1.48.
Yeah.
And that's normal because at the factory, they all vary a little bit. That's the silicon variance even within voltage. So even when people compare like temperatures against each other, I'm like, you can't actually 100% fully compare because unless your vid is exactly the same, you could have maybe like a 5, even 10 degree difference between the cores, and you might think, well, why am I having that variance? I saw this guy post this, and he has this same motherboard, this same cooler. You could do everything literally identical and still have variance.
That's basically why I tell my community to just try to stay off Reddit, because they'll say things like, mine did 6 gigahertz at 1.2 volts.
Yeah.
And it makes everybody else feel like shit.
Right,
because they're
or it
like,
makes you think
why
something's
does-
broken, right?
Yes, like
Yeah.
why doesn't mine do that?
Why doesn't
kinda-
do that?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a perfect point that you have to realize, oh, the vid tables are different between the two.
Right.
Some are a little bit more leaky, some are a little bit less leaky, so some might run cooler, some might be a little bit hotter. Some will boost a little bit more and some will boost a little bit less.
Right.
And that is the same thing that's happening here with the DRAM conversation. And I think though, if you generally look at it, it's quite impressive what Intel has been able to achieve, but we're almost kind of like in this trapped perspective that we think that the performance is somehow negative because we want more because we've been able to see what the peak is like.
Right.
But
yeah.
if you really look at it, 12th gen, right, was on average peaking at around 6,000 MT, around that resonant 75% average. Now, did you have CPUs that could hit 62, 64, 66 plus? Definitely.
I got one that does 68. Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But that was 12th gen. 13th gen, though, broke that, and we went to 7,000. 14th gen isn't really actually doing much better. It's about the same, right? Actually, we see maybe even a little bit of a more of a correlation.
Regression?
I wouldn't say regression. You might just see a little bit maybe more variability that actually goes up and below. So you actually might be able to see sometimes a little bit higher, but you might see like maybe 6,800 also, if that makes sense.
Right.
But as a whole, that's why. But if you look at that, like 6,000 to 7,000 with just in one gen jump, and then consider that the base frequency, the poor table at 12,000 was 4,800. That's insane that literally within that short time frame, you were able to go from 4,800 to 7,000 plus. I mean, we've never in 20 years of memory overclocking been able to see that level of scaling in that short period of time.
That's true. I did not expect DDR5 to progress that fast, honestly. But so the last segue into a question, and the last question.
Yeah.
So as a reviewer, back to my perspective, right? As a reviewer, how many motherboards should a reviewer like what are the odds of getting a dud versus like let's say I go to Newegg and buy one and get a dud? Like should I buy 3 of them? Should I buy 4 of them? How many?
Like, how do you account for the variance in a board?
Right.
So
how many samples do you need to actually be like, okay, on average, this motherboard can do 7,400. From you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Actually, I don't think that most users need to actually worry about quote unquote like binning motherboards. You're going to always see inherent to any production process variance. It's just the reality of anything in the industry when you're producing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of a product, there's going to be variance between a product. But the actual relative variance is pretty, I'd say, tight between kind of board to board to board. It's not like all of a sudden you could buy like a Dash E board and have like this one hit 78 and then like another one hit 7,000 and then hit like another one hit 72. That's generally not going to be the case.
Right.
Most of the time the variance, if there's variance there, it's probably within the range of maybe like 200 megahertz, maybe 300 megahertz at most. So you're not talking about a large variable. And in terms of actually like quality control, we have really some amazing advanced processes that we have in terms of our production facility to really check things like everything from advanced optical inspection for the socket to make sure that pins don't leave that are damaged, right? To actually checking trace contacts. And we're even bringing actually new advanced, more advanced AI-based systems in place that allow for more advanced SMT production processes and a lot of really cool stuff to try to make sure that the consistency is pretty tight. What I would really tell most people that you have to be concerned with from a dud or potential failure is pretty much a black and white DOA versus non-DOA, if that makes sense. So if I get my board and it doesn't post, okay, that's different than like I got my board and it doesn't hit 8,000 MT.
Right.
That's two different things.
You know, it's funny. It's anecdotal, but I'd say I've sold I've sold about 20 Apexes, and my community probably has another, I want to say 30 or 40.
Okay.
And we've had 2 that capped out at 7,600, and one that capped out at 7,200 actually.
Yeah.
So, about 3 out of 50. Something like that. Does that sound about right? In terms of like percentages?
It's hard. Right. It's hard to say, but I'd say it's reasonable if that makes sense, right?
Oh, they made them, by the way, and Asus gave us new ones.
Yeah. So again, you could be in a situation that if you looked in a much larger sample set, you could still have that be pretty low. But again, we feel very confident that as a whole, users don't need to worry about binning boards.
Right.
It's really much more about a DOA type scenario, and even in a DOA type scenario, I can't provide a number, I apologize for that, but we feel we're almost industry leading in terms of that perspective, that the consistency of when we put out a board, we've checked it in our production facility that you're not going to get a DOA board.
Gotcha.
So it's very, very low percentage.
Yeah, I haven't had a DOA one, honestly,
So really it just comes down to, like I said, that board variance. And I think the hard part, and I can understand it, right? I'm a consumer just like you're a consumer as a reviewer. I get that somebody can go like, I dropped $600 or $700, $800, and you're like, I want mine to be able to hit this target. But you have to also evaluate it from the perspective is, why don't you argue that same thing for the CPU? Why aren't we having that same conversation, right?
Right.
Because it's
I've had that so many, because people pay me for consulting and stuff, and they're like, I did this, and it's not working. Can you help me fix it? Yeah. And sometimes I do determine it's the motherboard.
Excuse me.
Give it a sec.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. It's okay. No worries.
And the whole reason I even brought this whole QVL thing up is because I feel these guys' pain. Man.
Oh no, trust me.
They dropped like $1,200 on an extreme.
Yeah, you just want it to work, right?
Yeah. And he's like, I bought a 7600 kit. I'm like, the best I can do is 7400, man. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just variance is variance. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's
you
why.
Just have to. But sorry, not to cut you off there. That's actually though why we spend a lot of time. We opened up our own PC DIY group community. We created a whole post on this topic called DDR5 Insights. We provided performance analysis directly from our overclocking team. Right. I've had multiple sessions. I've done live streams with Crucial and Kingston and other memory partners to actually dive in and talk about how the port table affects things. Why you need to understand that there is no such thing as sometimes a 4DIMM XMP. Right. Because at the end of the day, the only way that we get past this is by better understanding everything. So it's great that you give this information to the community, but I think there is some level of culpability as a consumer that if you're an overclocker, you do have to go like, look, if you want the absolute top end of the spectrum, right, or even I would say the kind of the higher end enthusiast end of the spectrum, it's not necessarily a purely plug-and-play experience. You might have to spend a little bit more time to inform yourself. But I do agree, though, that we can continue to do more. And,
sure.
And I think we can do more, like even adding like a little insert. I've talked with our CSE team saying, hey, having an insert on the motherboard, right, where it goes like, hey, if you put this in there, be aware that, you may have X and X conditional experience or something like that, right?
Oh, like a pop-up.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
I actually have one more question that I just thought of. It's just fascinating. From the perspective of the manufacturer, you guys, how do you combat, not misinformation, but like, remember the talk about the silicon quality on the Reddit thing, and this guy does the 1.1 volt, 6 gigahertz? They do that with DDR5 constantly, where I hit 8800, I hit 8600, and then you see a gamer would go into an overclocking forum and be like, wow, all these guys are hitting 8600, mine's doing 7600.
Right.
Is that frustrating for you guys? How do you combat that?
It's a big challenge. So, I mean, in that type of situation, I think it's always...
Does it have an effect at all?
I think, of course. I mean, you have to be conscious of having like echo chambers, right? Echo chambers that kind of reinforce either misinformation or potentially accurate information, right? And I think what we try to do is, I myself, as well as like our new community manager, we try to look at like forums like, Intel or overclocking and subreddit, spaces previously like Extreme Systems, right? PCMR, we might try to go in there. If we see sometimes anecdotal information, we sometimes try to go and chime in and be like, actually, you might want to actually keep this information in mind, that this is actually what is causing your issue. This is why you might see a little bit more variance. Thank you, sorry. Oh, it's okay, no worries. So I won't say that it's frustrating for us. I think it's just, it creates more confusion than anything else, right?
Right.
So I think it just takes time. The only way that you can fix that is just try to be more engaged and more communicative and try to be able to get people that information so they can better understand it. But I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure, yeah,
right?
go shoot, yeah.
So one challenge that I think that is very interesting is, how do you tackle mythos or kind of like old like diehard mentalities, right, that need to be readjusted to new architectural premises. So if we use overclocking as a basis, right, there's still a lot of overclockers that will look and they will only overclock things statically, right? They'll go like, I don't use offsets, I don't use an adaptive voltage, right? I go, I'm gonna overclock, I'm just gonna take all the cores at one frequency and I'm gonna use a static voltage. And I'm like, you're leaving frequency on the floor you're dumping way more voltage into your processor than you need because it's not idling down. So you're getting potentially an increase in voltage degradation, right? Like it makes no sense, but they're treating it like Sandy Bridge, right?
Right.
You know, and because it's like, but that's what existed on forums for like 10 years, so therefore that has to be the right way. Versus, right, hey, there's new architecture out here, you have this really intelligent voltage offsetting, which I know might seem a little bit more confusing. You're like, oh man, now I gotta a multiplier,
offsets, yeah.
right? But it takes time, right? You
Yeah.
gotta train, you gotta figure that out, right? So how do you break past that?
How I combat that on my channel, in my community, is if something is, we call it a toggle, like resizable bar or HAGs, hardware accelerated graphics or whatever, or even just offset and fixed, it's a toggle, go and test it. I honestly,
have a fist bump.
Seriously, I encourage people, even we have this common debate in my community that's like, should you have your top fans as exhaust or intake, right? And when DDR5 came out, top intake will blow air past them, drops temps a lot, right? And yet people are still debating
Do it for non-binary memory.
Yeah, and I'll just, now it's like, you know what? Swapping the fans takes 20 minutes out of your day. Just go test it. It's like people are so adverse to, they'll spend 2 hours researching something on a toggle. When it literally takes 10 minutes.
Just
to
try
toggle
it out. Just test it. Just see what happens, right?
So when it came back to like offsets, waves and peak boost on single core and all that stuff. So we'll have people come into the Discord as well. They'll be like, I want to do voltage frequency curve. I spent 6 months doing this. And then I'll actually counter with that one too. I'll be like, why don't you just try an all core? And he's like, oh, yeah, I could have just done that and it's done in 10 minutes, right? So there's like a time investment to dicking around with voltage curves for for too long.
There's always like that time to reward.
Exactly. So I just encourage offsets now. Just keep minusing it by 5 at a time until your stability.
Or if you got an Asus board, just use Asus AFC. It's a lot easier.
The AI overclocker.
Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started on that one, because that one, in my experience, for some reason when people enable that one, it shoves their 14900Ks to like 6.2, and it like shoves it on single core. And then it'll put like 1.55 into it. Now I don't know if that's safe. I know.
No. This is a good point, because this is old methodology, right? Because if you measure, go open XTU, go look at peak voltage. Voltage is aligned on a per step to the multiplier. An adaptive voltage will only increase in voltage on top of the base vid. Okay, so if your peak vid already on a 14900K, is let's say 1.48, and it sets it to 1.5, you've literally only done this moderate increase. And when you talk about an actual game, a real game, not Cinebench, not OCCT, okay, your game does this dynamic spiking. You can actually go into Asus AIOC. Do it. I want you to come back to me in a month. Guys, plug him in the comments. Let him know, hey, I want him to go back and tell me about this. We actually give you the ability that you can real-time track your sustained average voltage in real time in the UE5. We track it for you. So the really cool thing about this...
I got another point.
The really cool point about this is because I get people that says, oh, it sets at 1.5. This is going to kill my CPU. Extraneous comment, right? But if you actually ran it for a month, right, under normal real-world workloads, what you'll actually find is probably the voltage is going to be the average of what consistently was fed to the CPU is probably like 1.265, 1.275, because unlike a static vid, the voltage is dynamic. It comes all the way down, right? And it only gets increased every time that multiplier engages.
But isn't that same thing the exact thing that's degrading Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs now? So when Zen 3 came out, I think Techia City just found this one. If you take a Zen 2 or a Zen 3 CPU, like let's say a 3-year-old one, you plug it into like a Wraith Prism or whatever cooler stock, it will start blue screening from the factory now because they've degraded so far.
I can't comment on that without watching that.
But apparently that's happening en masse. because AMD's
don't know.
boost algorithm. Apparently, I don't deal with too much AMD stuff.
Yeah, I can't comment on anything in that. I don't know what that content is, but what I will note is if you overclock, right, regardless, you have to be willing to accept that there's going to be some culpability and degradation. If you do OC though,
sure,
right, that you don't get anything for free.
Sure.
There's a reason why a part is validated to only operate within a specific frequency and a specific bit table. So you can't, I don't want to say it's unreasonable, but I don't think it's very fair to say, I'm taking a part, I want to run it outside of factory tolerances,
sure, yeah,
and then say, oh, it should have not potentially degraded. But I think the best way to overclock, to maximize lifespan, is to do an adaptive-based overclock, not a static-based vid.
I agree with that.
That's unconditionally, I think, been proven that if you want to kill your CPU faster, even at what you think is a lower voltage, it's not truly a lower voltage because, again, nobody really knows this data because they're not actually checking it. The logic behind some users saying, I manually set my voltage to 1.25, so inherently this is better than you setting it to 1.5. The difference is you're looking at a one static plot point, right? But that's not the way your system works. If I was to track, again, over a month's period of time, right, we could literally be offering you just about that same voltage, but with a superior form of efficiency because the frequency and the voltage was coming down. Because again, with Asus AI, when you engage that, we could be dropping down to literally sub 1 gigahertz and 800 millivolts, right? That's not going to happen on a static bit.
But I also don't think that it's necessary. So like if 6 gigahertz
So define your own
exactly.
So my argument would be
exactly.
Asus AI gives you temperature target, voltage parameters, just define your voltage limit. So again, we're still making it easy for you because if you don't even know how to do anything, just pick your voltage limit and we'll give you the max overclock based on the voltage limit. If you don't like what we're doing, I disagree. I think that
I'll test it and get back to you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that you could actually set a voltage limit to Asus AI.
It's a tool. You have tons of flexibility. You could set a target for temperature.
You're talking about the BIOS tool, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah. You can go in there. If you want to set an ADC temperature target, do it. If you want to set a voltage target, do it. You know, we give you an unprecedented level of tools to say, look, we're making it easier for you to
I'm going to do a video on that.
To start overclocking without knowing all the stuff that you don't know, right? Because, look, think about this, right? If I ask you, go set my overclock based on an AC target, you as an enthusiast, me as an enthusiast, that is beyond tedious. There's no way for me to easily extract that data. I would literally have to go put in the values, stress test, check, see what my load is and target it. But it's so cool. With literally Asus AI, I can go in and set my max temperature target ADC and we'll pretty much lock it so that you never get anything over 80 degrees, right? That is cool.
And you have a voltage lock target too?
You also have a voltage lock target too. So if you feel that we're giving you too much, well then again, it's your choice. Do whatever you want. But we still make it way easier than you having to manually go in, set a whole manual VF curve, and not even know what the relative voltage frequency range is for your CPU. Because again, you don't know, right?
Right.
A user doesn't know whether my CPU can actually really hit 61 or 62 or 58 on 4 cores, right? But we've tested hundreds of CPU samples with literally almost thousands of permutations. The data set that we have, I think, is unquestionably the best in the industry. Nobody has anything like what we can do in that predictive table. So even if you want to tune it, that's okay. We designed it for you to tune it.
I'll test it. I'll totally do a video on that. I'll do a video that's like Asus AI, voltage target, temperature target, and then see if I can beat it or match it, or if it's worse than a manual
Sure.
OC.
But even from the beat it perspective, right? Like
time investment.
Right, it's time investment because again, you can do.
I mean, if one takes 10 seconds and the other one takes 5 hours, then that's a no-brainer.
Yeah,
too,
and
right?
the other thing that you can't do and you can't replicate from Asus AI, which is really cool, is keep in mind we keep the temperature target consistently being tracked. Why is that important? Well, let's say your AIO pump failed, right?
That's
if you set a manual based overclock and your pump failed, it's still maintaining that max frequency, right? But for us, we noticed that all of a sudden if your cooling performance score went down because maybe a fan bearing went down, maybe your ambient temperature gets hotter in the summer, maybe your pump died, actually will bring down the overclock. We're doing stuff that really, I argue, there's a legitimacy that we're really streamlining the experience in a way that nobody's ever done before.
I can see why that could be frustrating for the OG guys that have been overclocking for
Sure,
20
because
years.
you're taking away my ability to flex and be like, dude,
Yeah.
I know all of this stuff.
So
I've been
funny.
able to do it. But you know what? I've been in the game a long time, and for me, I generally go, look, even as an enthusiast, I use it as a starting point. Because the reality is,
Right.
how did you used to have to do it, right? Like even for a new DRAM kit, you got to spend all this time and go like, now I got to find out what's the scaling range for this new Hynix kit, right? Like I got to find out what voltage it likes, I got to like what TFRC it likes, I got to do this and this. Or same thing every generation, what's my bid range? Can it hit these frequencies? Can it hit these numbers? The great thing is now I can just buy the board, I can turn it on, I run my cooler performance index, it gives me that baseline, and sure, now if I want to manually tune it, I can manually tune it a little bit more or a little bit less, but it's giving me like 90% of the pathway.
Giving it to them out of the box.
Exactly, that it's just much easier. And the other cooler part is there's actually something that we call an optimism slider. So the optimism slider actually allows you to make a real-time adjustment to all the stuff that people don't get, right? Because again, if you don't know how to set a VF curve in general, if let's say you set Asus AI and it crashes, right? I would say for the majority of situations, that's probably going to be in less than 10% of cases. We feel very confident, the reliability is very high. But let's say it happens, normally you'd be stuck, right? You'd just be like, no, it's not stable, I have to just load defaults. Because the end user, they used an easy mechanism, so how are they going to know to actually change anything?
Exactly, yeah.
It's a chicken and the egg, right? They don't know what to actually change to make it more stable, right? But, sorry, if you can just, thank you, it's okay. But what we give you is you have the ability, you can go in and you can go with the slider and you can just go like in 5 increments. The default is 100%. But if you wanted it to be more conservative, you could go down to like 95 or 90 or 85. And then you could actually go the other way. If you want more, right, you go like, can I actually get a little bit more?
Yeah, maybe.
They actually let me go 105. Let me go 110. So even in that respect, we then, essentially you're adjusting the algorithm, right?
Right.
But in a way,
it's a lever.
Yeah, it's a lever, it's a toggle.
Yeah.
But in a way that you don't have to know all the things that are actually getting adjusted. Because to most people, they're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to change an LLC to, or I don't know what VF I'm supposed to adjust to. So it's a much easier toggle for them to just adjust the slider, man.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll give that a
Sorry,
shot.
I know we totally went on a different
that's totally
topic.
not, I didn't even know that existed, to be honest, because I just did my offsets and that was it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're pro, right? So it's just like breathing
that's
water,
true. Yeah.
right?
Something that makes it easier. I'm like,
yeah,
kind of thing, right?
No, yeah.
But that pretty much. I mean, I thought I had one more question, but I forgot it now.
Okay.
But whatever. Yeah, that's pretty good. I think we're good. I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Okay. JJ, man, that was amazing. Thank you for taking the time to just talk and chat.
It's been great. I appreciate it. And I'll let anybody know out there, if you guys have additional questions that maybe we didn't answer that you'd love to see, maybe more feedback on in terms of what we do from our product marketing messaging or just product design or feedback or anything like that, feel free. You can go ahead and email pcdiy@asus.com. Actually, I personally see that inbox, so it doesn't just go to like some corporate, account.
You live stream too, don't you?
Generally, usually every Friday. I try to every Friday on our Asus North America YouTube channel. We do a lot of community chat engagement. I do live demos. A lot of similar stuff that you do. I do it just, of course, from the corporate Asus side, right? But yeah, if you guys have questions, feedback, things like that, feel free to go and send our way. I'd love to be able to see what your guys' thoughts are in terms of, again, what we can do to improve feature, function, design, stuff like that, or even just information. And just a quick thing, highlighting in this DRAM, what would you think about this? This is actually something that we did talk about with our DRAM team. So probably one of the most key values right now that exists in DDR5 in terms of stability, especially per board, which can even be per board even of the same board. So again, if you had like 3 Apexes or 3 Dashies, is going to be VDD and VDD BQ because it tends to be a little bit more sensitive per board and even per CPU. So the values can change. So
the system agent is way more finicky on a per CPU basis, and the queue is way more finicky on a motherboard basis.
Motherboard side, yeah. So one thing that we've attempting is, so right now, of course, Asus, for years now, we've had multiple XMP presets, right? We have like XMP2, XMP1, XMP tweaked, right? But one thing we've maybe talked about is saying maybe to have like an alternate, essentially like auto rule adjustment parameter. So essentially you would like load that in, and then you would have like optional like VDD or VDDQ auto rules. Because again, a lot of users don't even know what to adjust if they run into the instability. But again, it becomes
now I remember the question I was going to ask.
Okay.
It was literally on that.
All right.
When will we get to a point when the motherboard can kind of read the memory controller SP and spit out the proper, like an AI algorithm?
That's something that we already tried to do, but it's very different because again, DRAM overclocking. There's almost no way to generally define the
sweet spot.
Without getting into the secret sauce of how we fully define the SP.
Gotcha.
Right?
Gotcha.
One thing I can denote is we're able to read the bit table per every CPU. That's very clear and very easy to understand. There's no bit table that you can read for the memory controller.
Right.
So from that perspective, it becomes much more problematic. There's no way that we can know the quality, essentially, of the memory controller. Now, trust me, our team is looking into how we can figure out, because we think if we could do that,
would solve the problem.
Exactly. We would be like, this would be the amazing thing, right?
Yeah.
So we have.
Oh, that'd be a game changer.
Yeah, we have some absolutely amazing engineers, and again, we feel like if we could do what we do with AIOC, but do that for DRAM, that's great. And again, we try to do that, right? Like by offering all these amazing DRAM presets, right? And hey, giving you more options, again, more toggles. But again, it can be really hard because you might not ever know where to start, right? And so we think that this might be a starting point that you can have an option to go like, look, if this is not stable, maybe the board comes back from the Watchdog retimer reboot, right? And if you guys don't know what I mean by Watchdog retimer, when a board generally like bonks out, it crashes from instability. On that follow-up reboot, it's usually because the Watchdog timer is kind of trying to figure out like, hey, I crashed, let me load back in normal kind of nominal settings. Ideally, this is what happens as opposed to you hitting the clear CMOS, right, to load everything up and get back up. But the goal would be like, it could come back and be like, hey, do you want to try an alternate auto rule set to attempt to run
that
stability?
Would work too.
So we're trying to look at some alternatives, but again, we don't want to bombard people with like options that feel like, I don't know what this means kind of thing,
Good
right?
points, yeah.
So if you guys have thoughts on this you think would be something you'd like to see, and maybe it could be like an advanced option, so maybe it's only like on Maximus boards or something versus like Strix boards or something like that. Maybe that's an option, I don't know, but it's something that we're talking about, and there's even many other things that we've discussed internally. So again, we are looking at things, but we're just trying to make it challenging. And even same thing, would you guys like to see, and what would be your thought? Like, we can wrap it up here, is 4 DIMMs, right? We still get people that talk about 4 DIMM stability and everything like that. We had discussed internally as a team saying, hey, if we notice you automatically put 4 DIMMs on the board, we're going to flag a prompt. We're literally going to flag up a prompt and show you like, hey, if you do 2 DBC, 2 SBC configuration, please be aware you'll see lower DRAM divider scaling,
I don't see any negative to doing that, to be honest.
Just to inform the user, right? Just letting them know, like, look, you might think that this works, but if you don't know anything, let's give you a little bit more information just so you have a better experience. Because again, this comes back to that saves us time and effort that somebody that calls our service and support team or emails or maybe returns the motherboard and thinks something's broken when it's like, it was just because they decided to have that configuration.
What about having the same prompt if they go over 7200?
Yeah,
like, hey,
that's actually something we've also discussed, right? But again, we don't want, to be frank, there's also the concern, you don't want necessarily people to think that you're offering like a cop-out, right? That you can't achieve that performance, so you're just giving me an out. But we do think it's a genuine factor that we would agree. If you,
I don't see it that
If
way.
you manually load this profile, like if you put a board and you put 7800, you already know not all my CPUs are going to hit this, so why don't we just let users know that? So that's actually something we're considering. We're also even looking at like the QLED lighting system. Maybe if you actually go to certain DRAM titles, the lighting changed from a different color to a different color. There's a lot of interesting things. So again, if you guys have thoughts, we welcome it. I think we've shown that we always take our
the battery's about
design
to die.
thinking at heart. So we'll wrap it up.
The battery's legit about to die. Okay. It was good to talk to you, man. That was fantastic. Anyway, catch him on his stream. Email him if you have any questions, or comment down below. And we'll see you guys in the next one. Okay.